Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Leann Chuboff, and I will be your presenter today. I am the Vice President of Food Safety and Technical at SQFI. I'm based in Chicago. Our offices are out of Washington, D.C., actually Arlington, Virginia. I have 25 years of experience, a little bit over 25 years in the food industry, manufacturing as well as food service. My focus was always in food safety, QA. I was an auditor. I've been audited, so I have experience in both. But my overall responsibility at SQF is for the development, implementation, and the continuous improvement of the SQF program, which brings us to our topic today, Edition 8. So if you are aware, Edition 8 was released in January of this year, after a good 2 years of gathering changes as well as posting for public comment, implementing and reviewing those comments into our final document. The draft was published last March, and then we had a 9-month implementation timeline. So typically we have a 6-month timeline, but this time we had a 9-month timeline because there was some formatting changes, a lot of different formatting changes, and we wanted to give our stakeholders ample time to implement that. So I'm going to proceed. I know we didn't get into too much fluffy in the beginning because I just want to make sure that we cover all of the changes that we have within the hour that is designated. So, and I want to make sure that I get to your questions. So whatever questions you have, feel free to put them in the chat box, and I will be able to get them to you in the chat box. So feel free to just go ahead and chat them in there, and I'll answer them probably at the end, but I will get to them. Also, just to let you know that this is being recorded. So you'll have an ability to receive the recording and view it again. You'll also be able, Perry Johnson will be sending out these slides. So you'll get a copy of the slides as well. And you don't have to take pictures or extensive notes or whatever, but you will get a copy of these slides as well as the recording of this presentation. So again, bring in your chats. I might be asking you questions, so feel free to chat back if you want, but we will start beginning right now. So, okay, before I get into the specific changes, I wanted to tell you our goals in designing Edition 8. It gives you some background as to where we were going as it relates to the final product for Edition 8. So for Edition 8, our first goal was to redesign, and we redesigned the Food Safety and Quality Code to fit the needs of the operation in the industry sector. So what we needed to do is take what we had and make it a better fit for those codes outside of manufacturing. So those familiar with Edition 7 know that we had that one code and we applied it to all the system elements, applied to every industry sector, and it really wasn't a good fit for food packaging, storage and distribution, and the primary. So we wanted to redesign those food safety and quality codes to fit the needs of the operation. Second, we updated those system elements and those industry practices to focus on our latest food safety issues and the regulatory requirements. So we wanted to look at what was causing recalls and what was causing outbreaks. We also needed to look at regulatory requirements everywhere, but mainly that is regarding FSMA and the implementation of FSMA. And we don't have a perfect, or we have a good fit with FSMA actually, except for the PCQI designation of the PCQI, but we didn't want to go ahead and make our code designed for FDA, only because even in the United States, we have 2 food safety agencies, USDA and FDA, and outside of the United States, there are all the different countries' food legislation, and we would have a code that was, volumes rather than pages. And so what we wanted to do was identify those requirements within FSMA and how can we put those into our own Edition 8. And so we took that into mind. And then third, we wanted to build a quality code that focused on quality. The level 3 requirements that we had was food safety and quality. The auditors were trained in both, in only food safety and not quality. And we wanted to bring, quality and focus on those specific elements. And so what we did is, focus on that and identify those quality requirements that are essential for a good quality program and building continuous improvement. And then lastly, in order to be benchmarked by GFSI, we needed to follow those requirements document. We submitted our application to GFSI, and we are going to apply for benchmarking to version 7.1. And so that is where we're going. Actually, GFSI already has a 7.2 out there, but we've already applied to 7.1. So next year we'll have to comply with 7.2. So moving forward, here was the old code, edition 7.2, and we, in a sense, we pulled out those different levels and put them into their own codes. So level 1 is now food safety fundamentals. And we have our food safety fundamentals program. It's the same concept as what level 1 was, except it's its own code. It's its own requirements. It still is that built-in approach where you have what's in level 1 is in level 2, is what's in level 2 is in level 3, but it has its own approach. It has its own code. We're also using, and we're in the process of revamping food safety fundamentals so that it is a solution to meet the GFSI Global Markets program. And we're using this program for small local suppliers that are starting out with food safety, implementing food safety, and building that food safety culture. And that's the premise behind level 1. For level 2, we have 5 different food safety codes focused only on food safety. So level 2, as you remember, it is only food safety. It's GFSI benchmarked, but its only focus is food safety. So we have a separate food safety codes for manufacturing, primary production, storage and distribution, manufacturing of food packaging, and then also a new code for retail. So again, all of these are focused on food safety. And then our level 3 is only about quality. So we no longer have our food safety elements in the quality code. Instead, it's its own quality code. It doesn't have any food safety. The focus is on quality. I would say comparably to level 3, the quality code is a good 85% the same as what those level 3 requirements were. 85 to 90. There's some emphasis in there, and I'll go over that as we get into that section. So with all of these, what will be benchmarked is only the level 2 or those food safety codes. So those actually only the 4 out of the 5, because we don't have a guidance requirements for GFSI requirements for retail under edition for GFSI under their current requirements document for version 7.1. So the only food safety codes that will be submitted to GFSI for benchmarking is manufacturing, primary, storage and distribution, and the manufacture of food packaging. So the reason we will only submit that is GFSI does not accept anything outside of food safety, meaning quality, and level 1 doesn't include a HACCP component, so it can't be benchmarked to food safety. So that's why we're only focusing on our manufacturing code to be benchmarked to GFSI. So let's begin on the changes. Again, I know our time, we have about 50 minutes, and I want to make sure that I get questions from the audience. Right now, I don't see any questions, so again, feel free to share with me any of your questions, and I would love to see them. Oh, actually, there are a couple questions. Okay, so I do see some questions, which is great. So I'll answer those right at the end. Okay. Okay, so part A is the code methodology, I like to call it. So it's about implementing and maintaining and sustaining the SQF code for suppliers. We made some changes in part A. First off is we added a requirement that all operational and cleaning shifts and pre-operational inspections are conducted where applicable. And what does that mean? It just means our expectation is that auditors are going to evaluate all of the facility, including all of the shifts, first shift, second shift, sanitation, pre-op if it's needed. It doesn't require a facility to have a pre-op. If a facility doesn't normally have a pre-op, if they're a dry blend or whatever it might be that doesn't require them to have a pre-op, then we're not mandating that they do a pre-op just for the audit. What we're stating is that if the facility has different shifts, that the auditor is to evaluate all the different shifts to ensure that the food safety system is being applied to all those different shifts. We also added an option for corporate audits. And again, this is an option, it's not a requirement. This is an agreement between the CBs and the sites. If there is a large corporation that does a lot of the program development for their multiple sites that are SQF certified, then there's an option that the certification body can go in and do a review of all these programs at the corporate level, and the results can be applied to all those different sites. Any non-conformances that have been identified as part of that corporate audit would need to be closed out prior to the site audit and the facility site audit. And if they're not, then those would be non-conformances at each of those sites. So there is just an option. The goal would be that the certification body would have a process in place in incorporating these corporate audits as part of their audit plan. There were new mandatory elements that were added for complaint management, all the scopes. That is now a new mandatory element. For allergen management, this is only a mandatory element for manufacturing, storage and distribution, and manufacturing of food packaging. It's not mandatory for primary. There is different requirements for storage and distribution as well as food packaging. And under manufacturing, that now includes feed and pet food. Allergen management is non-applicable for feed, and for pet food, it is a more specific requirement as it relates to the pet food industry. So it's not it's more related to what is required under pet food requirements versus manufacturing. We changed the corrective action closeout time frame. So now all minors and majors are closed out in 30 days rather than 14 days for minors and 30 days for majors. And we also removed the OIPs as a response. So OIPs are no longer a viable response. What we were seeing is that auditors were issuing OIPs as like half a minors or, an opportunity to do better next time. But that's not the point between OIPs, so we just removed them as a response. For unannounced audits, the protocol remains the same. However, what we were seeing for unannounced audits, the results were that the scores were the same as announced audits, that the non-conformances were basically the same as announced audits. But what we were seeing is that there was a little bit of a difference in management commitment. When there's an unannounced audit, it seems like there's all hands on deck and the focus is on SQF, and the SQF practitioner's job, it has a little bit more attention paid to it because they want to pass the audit, and an unannounced seems very daunting, there needs to be more focus. I guess that's what it seemed like. The management commitment was focused on SQF and the food safety system. So what we wanted to see is how could we make that every audit an unannounced audit? And we didn't want to do the mandatory requirement. We wanted to look at the carrot rather than the stick. So what we decided is that we added protocol for voluntary annual unannounced audits. And it's a voluntary option. The site would commit to unannounced audits for the next 3 years. And the recognition would be on the certificate as a select site. So the select site would be that, that the site is recognized as having annual unannounced audits, and it's recognized to their buyer, those retailers that see these certificates, recognized on the SQF website, those sites that are a select site. So again, it's a voluntary option, it's not mandatory, but what we are seeing is that it's a commitment to the site's food safety program, and what we wanted is that recognition of that commitment on the certificate to all the buyers, and that's how we approach this voluntary option. Again, it's not mandatory. You still have to have the 1 out of every 3 unannounced audits, but if you opt to go to an annual unannounced audit, then you would be recognized on the certificate. Surveillance audits and withdrawn sites are have been updated. If you are under a surveillance audit for reasons other than receiving a C comply, so it's only if you are under a suspension. So suspensions occur if you don't close out your corrective actions. Suspensions can occur if you have failed your SQF audit. So if that is the case, then you would be under a surveillance audit, and you would be placed under suspension. The suspension requires a 30-day on-site visit from the site or from the CV, and then a 6-month follow-up audit. And that 6-month follow-up audit is now unannounced. The next thing is with withdrawn sites. Any site that's withdrawn from the program for reasons under the code, such as they didn't follow the protocol when they were under surveillance, or they did some type of, they just withdrew for whatever reason they wanted to, they're posted on the SQF.com for 12 months, and they have to wait 12 months to reapply for certification. And then we also redesigned the food sector categories for a better identification of the industry scopes. And really, just a couple areas to focus on. Number one is the addition of nuts and where they would fit in each of the industry scopes. So FSC 4 now includes the pack house for nuts. FSC 14 is including nut processing, which used to be under FSC 22. And so that is now included in these food sector categories. We added HPP to canning. We also added, first we combined food storage and distribution into one food sector category, 26, and we added a new food sector category, 25, for repackaging of products not manufactured on site. And let me clarify what food sector category 25 is. Food sector category 25 is when products are unexposed. So you would have gift bags or baskets. You could have bulk wrapped candy into a mixed bag of candy. That is also considered repackaging of products not manufactured on site. So it's not having a combo of sugar, let's say, and making sugar packets. That's exposed product going into packaged product. This is all packaged product that's unexposed. Or skin on, let's say, like apples, oranges, bananas, pears, those kinds of things that make up that gift basket. That includes like a teddy bear and some flowers or whatever it might be, but the focus would be on that packaged food. And then we eliminated the category for brokers. That was the other big thing when it came to the food sector categories. So when you're figuring out if your food sector category has changed or not, you really need to focus or communicate with your certification body like Perry Johnson and figure out if that applicable food sector category has changed for you. Again, if you are manufacturing nuts or packing nuts, that is really the biggest food sector category that has changed. So that's something that you would want to make sure that you would talk to your food sector, your certification body about. So questions that we get is, does the site have to implement the food safety fundamentals before they implement the food safety code? And the answer is no. So it is a stepwise approach, but that's only if you're at the beginning level. If you're already at the food safety manufacturing and you want GFSI benchmarked a GFSI recognized certificate, let's say through SQF, then you would just go right to the food safety manufacturing, or the food safety code for manufacturing, storage and distribution, packaging, etc. So that's what you would have to do. But you don't have to implement food safety fundamentals. Actually, you do in a sense, because what's in fundamentals is in the food safety code. The next question that we get is regarding the quality code. And if you're a level 3 sites, do they have to implement the quality code at their next recertification audit? And it's kind of a tricky question, only because you don't have to do it. But if you want to maintain the recognition of having a quality code, then you would definitely need to implement the quality code. So if you want to maintain your level 3 status, then you have to implement the quality code, because level 3 is gone. So you have to then implement the quality code. Next question is, when will the codes be translated and which languages will they be in? And actually that has been completed. So our codes are translated in the key regions that we're in. Canada, it's in French, Canadian. Mexico, it's in Spanish. Japan, it's in Japanese. We have Australian, it's still in English, even though they have a different type of English, but it's still in English. And then we also have it in Chinese for our regions in Taiwan and China. And then the question is, what does a site have to do if their FSC change? And we, really just go to your certification body to make sure that you're under the right food sector category. And then the other questions that we get is, how are the requirements that are not mandatory assessed? So are those optional? And the answer is no. All aspects need to be assessed. If they are not applicable, then the site has to do a risk assessment. What we're stating with a mandatory element is that those mandatory requirements cannot be marked non-applicable or exempt, meaning that the site needs to have something in place to address that particular aspect. Allergen management is now a mandatory requirement. The site needs to have an allergen management plan in place. And even if they're not dealing with allergens or solely one allergen like an egg or whatever, there needs to be a plan to address what other potential threats could there be. Soy-based, lube ointment or whatever it might be, or hand soap that is almond-based, or whatever it might be that could be that potential threat to an allergen. So there needs to be that risk assessment completed, the allergen plan in place, and that's how it is. So let's go into those manufacturing requirements. Just trying to see what kind of questions we have. Okay, so let's go into the manufacturing system elements and the key changes. I'm just going to go over the manufacturing or the system elements for manufacturing first. Understand that many of these system elements were transferred into the other system elements in the other food safety codes. But I go through the manufacturing first because we still use manufacturing as our main means of basing the other codes. So in management 2.1 for management commitment, we did make some good changes in management commitment. First is that it's all focused on the senior site management. We want to make sure that the senior site management has a plan in place under 21210 in regards of the that if there's any operational or organizational personal changes within the company. So how are they addressing any significant changes? So note that it's not a written program. So we're not asking for a change management policy, but that there is some type of process in place so that there's minimal risk to the food safety plan if there is an organizational or personal changes. The next is regarding blackout periods for unannounced audits. What we were recommending prior in edition 7 is that the that blackout dates are allowed. However, they can only be for operational reasons. And what we were seeing is that sometimes that those operational reasons were because the SQF practitioner had a vacation, or the plant manager was out on a business trip, or whatever it might be. And that's not operational. What we mean by operational is that the facility is no longer isn't running. So as an auditor, they need to see the facility running and the products being run in order to evaluate those products. And now these blackout dates are auditable. So the auditor will look to see if they have been honored. The next one is that the practitioner has to update the senior site management on a minimum of a monthly basis. This update means that it can be via Skype or phone, or even an email. It has to be documented, as well as those, if there's any results from the updates. So the auditor will be looking as to how has this been conducted and what's the best process that they use. So it has to happen at least monthly. And then business continuity is just really changed terminology to crisis management, but the premises remains pretty much the same. For document control, the food safety management system is to include we just clarified regarding the food safety management system, so that it includes the entire food safety system, procedures, the good industry practices, your GMPs, GAPs, the food safety plans, everything else in order to implement the SQF program at the site. And then any changes that are made or any changes to the SQF system, to either validated or justified, understanding sometimes validated isn't an option. For specification and product development, we looked at inputs. So we always had in food legislation that the relevant legislation is applied in the country of destination, as well as in country of manufacture. So we included it into the inputs regarding where those raw materials were coming from. So they need to comply with the relevant legislation, not only if it was an import, that it's meeting the country of destination's regulatory requirements. For verification, we just corrected, it used to be validation of raw materials, so we clarified it as verification of raw materials under 2324. We also corrected verification of packaging materials under 2325. I believe it was validation of that. And then finished product labels, we just clarified it so it wasn't just product labels, but finished product labels to ensure that they comply with the relevant legislation. And then under 2331, we again clarified when specifications for contract services are required. It's really anything that's impacting on the product safety. So we always get that question, is the plumber or the electrician, can they impact food safety? And again, it really all depends on what the contract service is, but it's those lists of contract service providers that impact product safety. We updated the food safety plan under 2.4.3.1. It used to just be one requirement with a couple of sub-bullet requirements. Now there are 17 different requirements, but it's basically the same. It seems like it's the biggest change, with not the biggest change to be noticed. It's just that we broke out the requirements in Codex into those different steps. So 2.4.3.1 all the way through 2.4.3.16 actually goes through those Codex steps and principles under HACCP. So that's really what the biggest change is. 2.4.3.17 is a new addition, and it talks about where there's a difference between HACCP and the food safety regulations, meaning the preventive controls rule. What it's stating is that both need to be met. So that's a regulatory requirement, that there needs to be, if you want to use preventive controls rules for an example, that the facility needs to have the PC, the written food safety plan, as it relates to the preventive controls rule, but they also have to comply with HACCP. What we're not saying is that you need to have two separate plans. What we are saying is that both plans can be addressed in one written food safety plan. But it has to comply with HACCP and it has to comply with the regulatory requirement under the preventive controls rule. Why we did this and not one or the other is because GFSI mandates HACCP. So there's nothing we can do unless GFSI gives us the option to address preventive controls under FSMA or HACCP. But right now it's HACCP. And if you're a site that's under FDA reg, then you need to put in your food safety plan. If you want to also meet SQF, then you have to have a HACCP plan in place. Again, the two can be combined, they can be separate, whatever is your best fit within your operation. Approved supplier, we added food fraud. We added food fraud as a requirement in two spots. What I'm going to discuss right now is for the approved supplier program. So for food fraud, it's required for incoming ingredients that the site has to do a vulnerability assessment as it relates to their incoming ingredients. What we've seen is that sites need to do a vulnerability assessment to determine what their potential threats could be. They look at the nature of the food and whether it's one of those high-risk foods for fraud. They also look at the country of origin as well as the economic gain that could be achieved if food fraud occurred. So food fraud is the adulteration of food for economic gain. One example for food safety is that cumin, for example, was in short supply. They needed a filler for cumin, so it wasn't 100% cumin, and they used ground peanut shells in order to put that filler in place. So that's how food fraud was, that's the definition of food fraud. So it was economic gain, and it was a food safety concern from an allergen perspective. So it's a new requirement. The question that I see here is that food fraud is not listed as a mandatory requirement, which it's not. However, it's being treated by auditors as mandatory. Why is there this discrepancy? And if you believe that you don't need a food fraud plan, then you would have to do a risk assessment. So you would have to submit that risk assessment to the certification body and the auditor ahead of time in order to determine whether that could be exempt or non-applicable. So that would have to be conducted prior to the audit, which would be your best bet in order to determine if food fraud is not applicable. So just because you believe food fraud is not applicable in your facility, that means that you would have to make sure that you have to make sure that you have a good risk assessment in place. But just to clarify, I will say this particular requirement, 2.4.4, as it regards to approved supplier program, is a mandatory requirement. And under this requirement, it does include food fraud. So under 2.7.2, which we'll get to, which requires food fraud at the site level, that is not a mandatory requirement. So 2.4.4, like I said, food fraud split up into two areas. One is your incoming supplies, and the second is the applicable threats at the site level. 2.4.4 is mandatory, and that includes food fraud in these elements. 2.7.2 is not mandatory, and that is for the site, and we'll get to that in just a minute. So I just wanted to clarify that as well. Environmental monitoring is new to Module 2, not to Edition 8. So it's new to Module 2. It's always in Module 11 under high-risk facilities. We moved it to Module 2 under 2.4.8. It is not mandatory. Some sites do not need an environmental monitoring program. I'm fully aware of that. What that site would need to do is conduct a risk assessment. It would conduct a risk assessment as it relates to their establishment. And they would just have to demonstrate why they don't need an environmental monitoring program. Why we did this is what we were seeing is that actually we had recalls that were against an SQF certified facility because of listeria. When we checked their audit report, we saw that this area was marked as non-applicable, NA or exempt or whatever. And we were noticing that auditors were having a tough time understanding what's high risk and not high risk, and so were sites. So we decided that every site needs to have some type of risk assessment for environmental monitoring, either a risk assessment to opt out against environmental monitoring or a risk assessment to demonstrate how they are conducting their environmental activities. So that was added to Module 2. System verification. We updated a couple areas to make it more clear, especially regarding corrective actions and corrections. Prior to that, the wording was off and it really didn't support what a corrective action was. So we just changed the wording to say that corrective actions are determined, implemented, and verified. We also updated the records of investigations and those nonconformities, including corrections and corrective actions, are to maintain. We also state that we added a requirement under 2542 regarding proficiency testing, and the question came up, exactly what do we mean by proficiency testing? And proficiency testing is to be conducted to ensure that the site's testing programs that are conducted in-house are being are meeting standards. So typically what you do is you would send out a sample. You would send out a dual sample to a laboratory, an accredited laboratory, to determine if your testing methods meet those testing methods. So a laboratory would conduct the same test following standard principles and requirements, and then the results would determine whether your site whether your in-house laboratory has the correct testing method. So that's what we mean by proficiency testing. And that has to be conducted at least annually. In external laboratories, we just put it out there that says this is a contract service provider and it needs to be on that register. System verification, we updated, this is another one really regarding, I think, even management commitment under 2552. So we looked at internal audits. It's not just that we want to focus on the training, but more importantly on the competency of the internal auditors. So it's not just that the people have been trained, because it's still not an official internal audit. It doesn't have to be, could be on the job, it could be in-house. But bottom line, we need to ensure that the staff is competent in order to conduct these internal audits. And we also included in 2555 an emphasis on the records of internal audits and inspections. So what we wanted to do is make a differentiation between the internal audit and the inspection record. The internal audit is focused on the SQF system program. The inspections are those daily checks. So that it might include corrections like rewashing versus corrective actions, meaning long-term preventive control. So we wanted to update that and clarify that. Product identification, traceability, and recall. We added more to this to meet the retailer's expectations when a recall does occur. So how do you pull products off the shelf, and what's the right information that needs to be supplied from the site to the retailer? So we added a little bit more regarding effectiveness checks. We added more regarding how mock recalls in the investigation and the documentation that occurs around mock recalls. Specifically, we added in 2633 that the testing is to include incoming materials and finished product. And we also stated, we included in this, is now auditable, that the certification body is notified in writing within 24 hours and SQF is notified at the specific email address that's listed. Food defense, this is the second part of food defense. Again, as somebody had identified, this is not a mandatory element, and that is correct. It is not mandatory. It is not mandatory. The food defense is, we added that the food defense plan is to be reviewed annually. it's not just challenged at least annually, and then records are to be maintained. As it relates to food fraud, this is as it is in the site itself. So conducting a vulnerability assessment as to where there could be potential opportunities for food fraud in the site. The main concern that I hear about is regarding mislabeling. If there is, whether it's code dating or lock codes or whatever it might be, that's a potential vulnerability. But again, it's what's up to the site as it relates to their vulnerabilities and then implementing their mitigation plan. So when it comes to food fraud versus food defense, it's threat assessment versus a vulnerability assessment, mitigation strategies, and impact assessment. What we need is procedures in place for food defense and food defense verification procedures. So food defense is that intentional adulteration to cause harm, where food fraud is economic adulteration. The intent isn't to cause harm, but it's for economic gain. So that's just the different mentality. Again, it's threats versus vulnerabilities. And you still have to take that same approach, pretty much, is identify where there's potential areas of concern and put in policies and procedures in place, or methods or operational controls so that it doesn't occur. That's really what it is. We have a lot of sources of information, because the question we get is, do we have our own vulnerability assessment that we could provide to food fraud? But there's so much information that's out there. Some you have to pay for, some is free. I know for food fraud, the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, that's paid for, but Michigan State has a lot of good resources that are free. There's a publicly available standard on food defense as well as food fraud, so that it can be used as well. And then there's also PricewaterhouseCoopers has some stuff, and SSafe has some information as well. So you can definitely find some good information that's out there regarding food defense and food fraud. Allergen management, we did make a change to this. As you noted, it was mandatory. The one area that we are getting a lot of questions about is regarding the statement under 2.8.1.1, is that the allergen management program shall include the identification, management, and labeling of products containing gluten where applicable. And what we are stating is that under 2.8.1.1, this is required only if it's a regulatory or a customer requirement, so that this may, how you're handling gluten, what we don't want. So this is more importantly, what we aren't expecting is that sites just include gluten on their label. Where we're stating is that it should be included as part of the allergen management program, but it doesn't have to change your labeling or anything else. It's required. Labeling is required only if your regulatory or customer requirements are in place that mandate that you do that. So module 11, I know we're running out of some time. I'll try and get to some of your questions as well towards the end. I don't want to lose them. So module 11, I'll go through some of these differences. Pest control. Bottom line, we changed some terminology, vermin to pests, flies to insects, just to try and encompass all pests and insects that are in there. Clarified poison rodenticide bait rather than just poison bait, because poison could be, depending, it's the eye of the beholder, right? Whether you're a fruit fly versus a rodent, the intent is that we didn't want any risk to the product. So its focus is on rodenticide bait versus just all poison bait. We also changed the terminology to pest management. We didn't talk about, we didn't have pest management or pest control. Instead, it's pest prevention, because that's the focus, is to prevent the pests, not manage them once they're in the facility. We added a couple new elements regarding pest trending that has to occur, as well as the disposal, investigation, and the resolution of pest activity that needs to occur. Equipment, we added a couple things, or we added new things for equipment. First off, we added that specifications for equipment, utensils, and protective clothing needs to be in place, meaning that we need to understand the type of equipment that's in the facility. We've had too many used equipment being new to the facility. So it's not new equipment, it's new equipment and equipment that's new to the facility, meaning refurbished equipment. Where did it come from? How should it be cleaned? Is it the right fit for our operation? And I'll use Jensen Farms as an example. They had a potato washer to use to clean cantaloupe, and that wasn't the right piece of equipment and caused some significant issues that led to illnesses and deaths due to listeria. We also made sure that equipment design and construction is to meet applicable regulatory requirements, again, to ensure the right piece of equipment is in the operation. Product containers are readily cleaned. We looked at cleaning equipment to ensure that it's cleaned at regular frequency, so that it's not, we don't introduce or recontaminate food. We added a new element regarding temporary repairs. Previously, we didn't allow temporary repairs, which just was not feasible. So we're allowing temporary repairs. However, there needs to be an expiration date, and they need to be used in a manner that's not going to contaminate the product, or that can be cleaned and sanitized. We added new requirements for clean in place systems. We also added new requirements for labeling of detergents and sanitizers so that they meet regulatory requirements, as well as detergent mix concentrations and how they're being used and labeled and stored. For personnel, we added a couple things as well. We eliminated the first aid kit, but now have a requirement for contamination of product caused by bodily fluids, mainly vomiting and diarrhea, and how that can be, if the occurrence happens, how that's going to be contained, so it's not going to be a risk to the product. We added a new requirement, 11331, regarding a risk analysis on clothing or the hair policy. What we were receiving is a lot of questions regarding smocks and how can smocks, can I have a buttons on my smock instead of it snaps, or does my upper pocket need to be sewn shut? And my question was always, or back to them, I don't know, tell me, can it? Do a risk assessment to determine who should have buttons versus smocks, or can have anything in their front pocket versus their, hip pockets or whatever. So that's a new requirement. Visitors are either to be escorted or be trained in their food safety practices. We included that toilets have to have an outside area to hang the outer garments. We required outside eating areas to be neat and tidy. And we also talked about drinking water containers in production and storage areas. So allowing the drinking of water as long as it's not going to be a risk to the product itself. Water and air quality, added a couple new things, or just really clarified some stuff. Compressed air now includes other gases such as nitrogen blends or flushes or whatever it might be. The compressed air systems, what we're looking at isn't just microbiological hazards. Instead, we're looking at applicable food safety hazards, which would be biological, physical, and chemical. Chemical is really the biggest threat that we have as it relates to compressed air. So we need to take a look at that as it relates to the entire compressed air system. We added storage and handling, that there has to be a plan in place to protect foods from contamination, whether it's dry, refrigerated, staging, or frozen. So we added 11611, which is the requirement of a storage plan as to how to make sure that foods aren't going to be contaminated. We also added a new requirement regarding the disposal of trademarked material. So how can trademark material be managed, whether it's packaging or whether it's a food item, so that it's not going to be used against customer requirements. And we added a new animal for the control of inedible as it goes to edible for animal feed, if that animal is to be slaughtered for human consumption. I'm going to move on to the primary system elements. I know we're running out of time, so I'll go through some of these rather quickly. But again, you're going to get the presentation. You'll get a copy of the presentation. You'll get a copy of this recorded presentation, and you can certainly use, contact me at any time if you have specific questions. So for the primary system elements, they generally follow the manufacturing. We did focus on the farm rather than the processor, so we eliminated any of those references regarding that. We looked at shelf life studies and we removed those requirements for shelf life studies as it relates to primary production. We looked at the requirements for contract manufacturers and made it more specific to the primary on the farm, especially as it relates to produce, but really simplified that so it's not as cumbersome since there's really aren't a lot of contract manufacturers used on the farm. We used specific references to HACCP-based models, so we are allowing HACCP-based systems to be used and not a full-blown out, or it's still HACCP, but HACCP-based is based off of a known industry. So like the tomato matrix or the leafy greens agreement, that would definitely be acceptable. We looked at whether products were non-performing and revised that element. And allergen management is not mandatory, but it has been consolidated and it is definitely more applicable to primary production so that it is focusing on the risks for primary. In Module 7, again, focused on the farm and not the processor. We evaluated the potable water requirements as it relates to hand washing, and it's got to be clean water. We changed the glass houses and hydroponics to reflect more about greenhouses, hydroponics, and mushrooms. So it's specific to mushrooms because that was always that category that we didn't know it's grown indoors. So we needed to make requirements for that. We looked at controlled atmosphere storage. And we looked at the exclusion of domestic and wild animals. Instead, we changed it to control of those because it's hard to manage or exclude wild animals from the growing fields. Requirements to wash hands before putting on gloves, that the pre-harvest risk assessment is now been moved to harvesting and field practices. Additional requirements for personnel practices for field packing, putting more emphasis on, the hand washing, glove usage, smocks, etc. We added the requirement that no raw untreated manure should be used, and instead we just said no raw manure. Before it used to be no raw manure, but now it can be, it has to be treated. There's a new element for the chemical applications, for the new requirement for chemical applications, and then also again a requirement on disposable of trademark material. Let's go into distribution. So distribution follows manufacturing again. This is specific to storage and distribution. We evaluated specifications, so instead it's about product handling requirements, less about specifications. So it's not focused on checking the requirements for the incoming materials, but more about how to handle them, whether they need to be refrigerated or frozen, stored dry, above product, etc. We looked at contract third-party storage rather than contract manufacturers because that's more applicable to distribution. We added in storage and distribution the HACCP approach that can be used. Environmental monitoring is not applicable for storage and distribution, so that is not even a requirement. And allergen management is in there, and it's a more consolidated approach focused on storage and distribution, mainly if there's a product that busts open, how is that controlled so that it's not contaminated other product. We did remove the reference to pre-op for cleaning and sanitizing, knowing that happens all day. Again, removed the first aid kit, put the requirement regarding contamination caused by bodily fluid. It's focused on those employees that are that aren't, there's a lot of focus before on employees that were handling product. And typically storage and distribution, they do not handle product. So we removed a lot of those references. We added the requirement that drinking can be allowed in the facility as long as it doesn't pose a risk to the product. Made a statement regarding hand dryer and if there is no direct contact of food or food contact surfaces, because that's typically what's in the restroom areas. And then we added new requirements for drivers. How are they being handled and managed within the facility? Again, for personnel requirements, looked at the wearing of false fingernails, eyelashes, etc. Only when product is exposed and not when it's not exposed. We deleted all those references to washing, thawing, and treating foods because that wasn't applicable in that facility. And we added again those requirements for general storage area. Stock rotation hasn't been eliminated. Same goes for all of the food safety modules. It's been pulled into the good distribution, good manufacturing, agricultural practices. And we also provided clarification from the receipt of and storage of chemicals versus those that are being used on site and what those practices should be. We added a new requirement for trailer washing. We added a new requirement regarding loading, transportation, and unloading of the product and staging of the product and making sure that trailers are in good condition before loading. We also, so for food packaging, just to move on, for food packaging, again, focused on the risks associated for food packaging following manufacturing, but added elements regarding that if there's any type of packaging that's being designed for a functional effect, there needs to be specific requirements in place. So if it's used to protect shelf life or, encapsulate the nitrogen flush or whatever it might be, then it needs to have a function, then there needs to be requirements in place. We eliminated those references to shelf life trails. They weren't applicable, but we added requirements for records and validated storage conditions. A new element regarding the approval of artwork for primary and secondary packaging, especially as it relates to ingredient statements, if they are on that packaging statement. And again, especially for allergens, lot codes, etc. We removed any references to the validation of those packaging materials. It didn't make any sense. We modified it to make sure it includes product. There's a modification of 2351 so that it's focused on the product ingredient list, allergens, and identification codes. Any references, remove the reference to requirements not applicable to food packaging in 2411 as it relates to food legislation. Reworked product and recycled product are new requirements and focus on those materials that are used to recycle, like paper plates or napkins, etc. And again, information shall be that's handled that prevents any mixed or intermingling product. And environmental monitoring has been added under 2.4.8. New requirements for product testing, new procedures for verifying the correct printing plates, analox rollers or cylinders, new element for procedures for effective storage of those plates. 2.6.3, it's been reworded so since not a lot of recalls happen at the manufacturing facility for food packaging, it really is focused on the role that the food packaging industry plays as it relates to recalls. And allergen management requirements have been consolidated and applied to food packaging. We already went through that. For 13.2.1, as it relates to floors, understanding that there's different areas within the facility, in a raw area where like broken glass is stored versus the finished product of the glass bottle. So the floors need to be fit for purpose. new element to clean and sanitize product equipment if using compressed air so that it's not going to contaminate neighboring lines. References to pre-op has been deleted. References to cleaners and sanitizers have been deleted. Again, drinking water is permissible, and training visitors or escorting them on site for food hygiene. The last code that we have is on food retail. So the retail operation, now can be assessed by SQF. There is a corporate audit and there is a store audit. There's a multi-site program. So the corporate audit looks at the policies and procedures that have been developed at that corporate level, and then how they're being applied at the store audit or at the store level. So the store audit focuses on those good retail practices like cooking temperatures or storage requirements, as well as those specific requirements that have been imposed by the corporate. So training and frequency of training, as well as grinding logs or any of those other records that have to be identified at the store level. So this is a new code for us. We actually have a lot of retailers, a number of retailers that are anxious to get this started to see how their food safety systems evaluate against the SQF program. So it's kind of exciting. Some of the things that we have available, some of the resources we have and we have done are available. Go to our website. There's lots of information, SQFI.com. If you go to the documents webpage, the documents page, all of our codes, our guidance documents are available, free to download. We also have a number of videos and webinars. We are starting up our Learning Lunch program again that focuses on specific code requirements. The one way to hear about all of this information is our SQFI newsletter. So our newsletter, is our one point of information, and it's where we hold all of our industry updates. We provide an idea of some of the hot topics that we're looking at, or news articles that we're looking at, the training opportunities that we have, the events that we have coming up, any of our featured webinars on our YouTube page. So if you go to YouTube, you can search for the SQFI YouTube page, the tools and resources that we have. And we also actually have a supplier spotlight. So, I mean, maybe you feel like you should be highlighted in our SQF newsletter. Feel free to reach out to me or any of the SQF contacts, and we can investigate that further. So it'd be it's a great tool. If you're not part of the newsletter, email me and I can hook you up as to how you can be a part of the newsletter. But go on our website and you can search newsletter and you can see all the past newsletters that we've had as well. But it's a great source of information for you. Alrighty, that takes care of that. What I want to do is, answer your questions now. I don't know why the sharing of the screen is paused, but I'm just going to go ahead and answer your questions. So the next question that came in was, how can we differ SQF from other GFSI schemes? And there's a lot of different information that's out there regarding the different schemes that are available through GFSI, benchmark schemes. So it depends. You can go on mygfsi.com to take a look at who the other schemes are and what they're benchmarked to. SQF, we have our own advantages where all of our documents are free to print or download or whatever you want, especially the guidance documents. We have all of our certification bodies online. We are the only farm to fork standard that's out there. So if you want more specific differences, you feel free to reach out to me and we can definitely work out to that. The other question that came in is, will the annual voluntary unannounced audit occur within the 30-day window of your initial certification date? So yes, it's actually 30 days either side of that window. So it's a 60-day window. So the annual voluntary unannounced audit follows the same protocol as it relates to the initial certification audit date. So it's 30 days either side of that window. keep going. How will successful completion of the quality code appear on your certificate? So that would be a scope extension. You would have your food safety code that's honored and listed underneath the certificate. And then you would have your quality code be listed as a part of your scope. So you would say, it would say food safety code for manufacturing and SQF quality code edition 8. That's how it should appear underneath your certificate. So all the codes that you have been certified to should be listed under your certificate. Next question is regarding 2324. Is inspection of raw materials ingredients acceptable in lieu of COA's letter of conformance or testing? And yes, it is. So I want to look up the code requirement 2.3.4. 2.3.2.4. I'm sorry, 2.3. So it shall be validated and ensure product safety is not compromised and materials fit for its intended purpose. And they can include certificate conformance, certificate analysis, or sampling and testing. So yes, you can indeed do the testing yourself. So you don't have to have a COA. In fact, those COAs need to make sure that the specific testing is occurring anyway. So you can definitely do that yourself. Question is there tools available to determine if your processes are high risk? You know, that is such a good question. And I don't know. I mean, FDA has their own definition of high risk. I don't even know if they've defined it yet. I don't even think they've defined it yet. So in our code, we do define high risk, so a high risk process, high risk product in the glossary. So you can read the glossary, determine if your facility is high risk. Bottom line, if you're doing anything ready to eat, that's going to be high risk. If there is no further processing before you give it to the next, onward to the next chain, whether it's the consumer or whether it's another supplier to use your ingredients, and they're not going to do anything to your product, then you would be deemed probably high risk. That's how I would look at it. All righty, I think those are all the questions that I have that were sent in. I'm trying to make sure that I have everything else, but nope, I don't have any other questions. I think I got to them all. I appreciate all of your attention today. Sorry to go through the last bit. I wanted to make sure that we closed out in an hour. Again, we will be sending out this webinar as well, the recording of this webinar, as well as all of my presentation. My contact information will be on the first and last slide, so that if you have any questions, feel free to contact me and I'd be happy to answer them. So thank you all, and many thanks to Perry Johnson for their support in this webinar. We did a lot of Edition 8 updates last year and didn't have, and actually I think people just hit them this year that what do I have to do for Edition 8? So I appreciate this opportunity with Perry Johnson and sharing with you the information about Edition 8. I wish you all the best, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.